Chapter 4. Getting Settled. Bobby had been staying in a low-rent hotel close to the embassy. He would have preferred to live at the embassy with Doug and the family, but that didn't look promising. Mr. Grant has made sure that only senior personnel lived at the embassy. An executive assistant like Bobby could make it on his own, he said. This did not sit well with Doug, and he let the pompous little man know it. Robert is my executive assistant and a close personal friend. I need him available at all times. He has been cleared to see everything that I do, Doug told him. I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson, that is the policy, so it's out of my hands. He said in a tone that was obvious to all that he was being a prick on purpose. Grant was of medium height and thin build, wearing a cheap and ill-fitting suit. He was a light-skinned black man or a somewhat dark-complexioned white person. It was hard to tell. He had some acne scars on his face and the overall look of a weasel. Don't worry, Dougie. I'm sure there is a way around this jerk. Let me work on this for a while, Bobby said when they were out of earshot. All right, I will leave this in your sick and twisted hands, Doug laughed as he walked away. He was already starting to feel sorry for Mr. Grant. Being on Bob's bad side had unpleasant consequences, sometimes fatal. On his next visit to the Black Cat to see his new friend, Mr. Lopez, Bobby noticed two things instantly. One, he was the only other white man in the crowded bar. He expected that. What he didn't expect was all the smiles and nods of welcome and recognition he got from the other patrons. It was like he was a returning hero from the war. People were coming over and introducing themselves and buying Bobby drinks faster than he could drink them, and he did his best not to offend his new friends. 4 hours later, a very intoxicated, half-Irish, Mexican Indian was unceremoniously dropped off from a taxi in front of the U.S. Embassy, where he staggered up the walk and held on to the wrought iron fence. Then he promptly threw up in the bushes before trying to enter the front gate, only to find it closed for the day. Bobby was too drunk to be concerned, but his friends were. Doug and Sharon were walking the grounds when they saw Bobby roll up in the cab. They found him in the garden, lying on a cement bench. What happened to you, Robert? Doug asked in a mock scolding tone. I'm way too drunk and I need to crash. What do you think? He slurred. I'm not sitting here waiting for a streetcar, Bobby said, laughing hard at his own joke. I can see that, tough guy. What do you say we get you back to your hotel? That would be a good idea, Dougie. How do we get there? You just sit there a minute and let me figure this out, Doug said. I'm not going anywhere. I just want to rest for a minute. And with that, he laid down on a concrete bench and promptly went to sleep. If we send him back to the hotel in a cab, he would get rolled or worse, Doug said. Then I guess we will have to take him home, Sharon replied. Driving up to the Hotel National, they could see that this was low rent to say the least. They had to fight their way through the pimps and other hustlers, trying to make some money by any means. It was only a question of time until something very bad happened. Either Bobby would injure or kill someone trying to hurt or rob him, or Bob would suffer serious injury at the hands of the local lowlife. Neither of these scenarios was acceptable. That being said, Sharon decided to see what could be done for Bobby. The next day, Sharon decided to speak with Mr. Grant, hoping to find some pretext to get Bobby on grounds. When she found the Director of Culture and Protocol, he was in a snit over the seating arrangement for an upcoming function. Could I speak to you for a moment? Sharon asked. Yes, Mrs. Wilson. What can I do for you? His impatience was not hidden well. I wanted to talk to you about getting Mr. O'Shaughnessy quarters here at the embassy. It would be much better for everyone if he were closer to us. I'm very sorry, Mrs. Wilson, but only senior embassy personnel can be quartered here at the embassy. Otherwise, we would have every Tom, Dick, and Bobby trying to live here for free, he said, laughing at his own weak joke. Sharon was not laughing. This nasty little man was starting to bother her. She had made what she felt was a very reasonable request. His turning her down was bad enough, but the fact that he took joy in abusing his authority was an insult at best. If money is the problem, I'm sure Mr. O'Shaughnessy can pay his own way, or we would be happy to cover his expenses as required, she told him. Mrs. Wilson, he said in a tone reserved for children and other people he felt were beneath him. Only senior personnel can live in the embassy. There just isn't room. I wish I could help, but I can't. So even if you wanted to, you can't. Is that what you were saying? Yes, Mrs. Wilson, that's it. Mr. Grant said in a manner that was not convincing, especially when Sharon knew there was a spare bedroom in the back. Very well, Mr. Grant. Thank you for your time, she told him. This would require a woman's touch, and perhaps some of Bobby's muscle, she thought to herself. Either way, Bobby needed to be with his adopted family, and that's all there was to it. Out in back of the embassy was the old chauffeur's quarters. It was a small 2-bedroom cottage with a separate 3-car garage. It was a mess since no one had lived there for many years. It looked like the perfect bachelor pad for Bobby. The problem was she knew that a scheming little prick like Grant would never allow it. There had to be a lever to convince this man to be reasonable.